And I'm going to now pass over to Shamubeel Eaqub. Now, Shamubeel, again, a wonderful, I get this joy of introducing. Shamubeel is an experienced economist who made economics easy. He's a thought leader, unafraid to take contrarian view. If you've ever read any of his work, you'll know that. He is not afraid to speak his mind. He's an engaging and knowledgeable speaker and is a regular and respected contributor to media, government, and business sectors discussions on economic and strategic matters. He holds a BCom with honours in economics from Lincoln University. He's a local boy and is also a chartered financial analyst. He has authored Growing Apart, Regional Prosperity in New Zealand, co-authored Generational Rent, and The New Zealand Economy, an introduction. I have immense pleasure in introducing to the podium Shamubeel Eaqub.
Thanks, Rose. I haven't been called a boy in a very long time, so thank you for that. Look, it's great to be here, and I feel like I'm going to repeat a lot of what we've talked about, and I suspect that's the common theme of the day, that we all know this stuff. But let me come at it from a slightly different perspective. I'm an economist, and I like charts, so I'm going to show you some, and you can pretend to like them as well. I'll start with the reality of living in fat tails. And the reality is that when I spoke to the Insurance Council at their conference 10 years ago, when climate change was the key thing, they knew exactly what would happen. That claims would increase, that premiums would increase, that coverage would retreat. We had already talked about those things. And the discussion then was, if we don't do something now, that is what New Zealand will be left with. And if you look at the numbers in terms of climate change, well, climate-related natural disaster insurance claims, so this doesn't include all the bailouts that we have for households and businesses. It doesn't include the Christchurch earthquakes because that wasn't counted in part of these statistics. We used to be better, have fewer losses than Australia. It was over there that they had the fires and the floods, but now we have them. And when we have them, the costs are huge. You look at that green bar, which is only for half of the year, they're already much bigger than we've experienced in many, many decades. We know that when we live in fat tails, our events are going to be more severe, they're going to be more frequent, and they're going to be more unpredictable. This is the reality, and it is not going to change. The very first thing that is going to happen, of course, is our insurers who want to take your money, and they want to give you a service, but not if it's too much risk. And the reality is that we know that the first thing that's coming for New Zealand now is those insurance premiums that increased in Australia over the last 20 years because they had experienced more losses are coming today. Our insurance premiums are going to rise by, at a minimum, by 40% over the next couple of years, at a minimum. What do you think that will mean for people who have low incomes? What do you think it will mean for places that get flooded? What do you think it will mean for the future of New Zealand? Do you really think that we're going to have widespread insurance coverage like we had during the Christchurch earthquakes? Do you really think we're going to have widespread coverage like we had, relatively speaking, in the floods in Auckland? No, because it will simply not be affordable, nor will it be available. The rationing that is coming is going to be significant, and if we don't act, and if we don't do something about it soon, we are going to have ghettos. We're going to have ghettos where poor people will live and they will not have support. And they'll keep going back there because it's the only thing they can afford. We are creating the ingredients for social disruption and fraying of our social fabric. So much of the activities over the course of the last 10, 20 years when it comes to climate change has been about mitigation, which is absolutely fine because we need to do all of those things. As Rod said, of course we should reduce our emissions. We need to use less fossil fuels. We need to change the way that we do transport and the way that we live. But we also know that our efforts over the next 10 years must include much greater focus on adaptation. How do we live with the world that is different? And it is not something that is happening somewhere else at some other point in time to somebody else. It is happening to us right now. We're already living in unseasonably warm springs. I was not able to land in Dunedin yesterday because it was too windy. My friends had to stay inside in Melbourne yesterday because it's so hot. It's spring. It's unseasonal, and it is happening right now. The difficulty and the opportunity for adaptation and dealing with climate change in many instances for me is the fact that mitigation is very big, very global, big policy levers. Adaptation is local and it's specific. And that is both its weakness and its strength. It means those of us who are in the room, we can start doing things when it comes to what are we going to do and how we're going to deal with it, because it is here that we can make those choices and those decisions. But we are going to have to make a really big shift. We are focused exclusively and too highly on mitigation only. Those things are, of course, important, but we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able to also invest in adaptation, because if we don't, it's not only going to hurt people, it is also going to create social disruption that will persist for some time to come. And I don't want you to kind of forget just how important this social part is, because everything that we do in society requires the collective first. You must have collective buy-in and collective consent. And if you don't have that, it is not sustainable. Then it is volatile, that it is not durable, and we need durable change. Already we know that in New Zealand, lowest income households don't have insurance. And most of the insurance that poor people have is for their cars. They don't have it for their homes. They don't have it for their contents. Did you see what happened in Wairoa with the cyclones? Those people did not have insurance. How many times do you think the rest of New Zealand will go, yes, that's okay, just we'll dip into my pocket and I'll pay for that? How many times do we think we can lean on goodwill rather than good policy and good process? We know that insurance coverage is already falling. For some reason, I keep getting invited back to the Insurance Council conferences to speak to them. I'm really depressing, right? I keep telling them that you guys are bad people because you're just going to walk away. And they're like, can you come back? Sure. But we know that insurance coverage is falling because the incentives are not there, because the risks doesn't make sense. New Zealand is a very risky country, but at the same time, we pay extraordinary premiums. So they will stay here for as long as necessary, but they're not going to be the ones who create the solutions because it's not their job. But in many ways, we are relying on the insurance companies and others to do the decision-making for us. The signal that we're going to get from the insurers is going to be very strong. They're going to tell us very clearly that it is expensive to insure you. We don't want to insure certain kinds of risks. We are going to ration because we don't want that kind of risk on our books. And that really matters. That really matters because it's going to mean that there will be parts of the country who will not be able to have mortgages for their homes. That means we're going to create these separations, these lines across floodplains, around sea level rise, around places that are more affected by storms or whatever. We've seen that already with what's happening with the cyclones, that if you've been flooded, if you've been inundated, it's happened too many times. The insurance company is saying no more. We're going to be like America, where one side of the river is okay and the other side is not. The high side is okay, the low side is not. You're on the wrong side of the levee, and we are going to put all the poor people there, and somehow we're going to be okay with that. I don't think that's going to work for New Zealand, because the reality is that when you're a country of 5 million people, the politics and the social license really matters. I'll use the Christchurch example in terms of why I'm feeling so frustrated at the moment with our public policy processes. And not that, like Rod said, it's not that we don't know what the policy is, it's the lack of leadership to implement. When you look back to the earthquakes, we had the perfect lessons of what to do differently, why we need systems change and we need systemic thinking, why it should be joined up, and we didn't. We responded heroically on the back of the earthquakes, but we learned no lessons. There were no systematic approaches to future disasters. We reinvented the thing every single time. Oh, there is a flood in Auckland, we better have special emergency legislation. Oh, there is a cyclone, we better have special emergency response. How many special emergencies will you have in the fat tails? And how many times can you go back to your people and say, oh, by the way, these people got flooded and you are going to pay for it. All the losses in our society will be shared, but all the gains are privatized. This is not going to work. The bailouts that we have as a model, that somehow people are going to be made whole because somehow if you own your property, you are owed some duty by the rest of society, is not something that can be sustained. We simply will not have enough goodwill left in society when you're parking large parts of your society in ghettos. Where do you think that goodwill come from? It will not be there. But what frustrates me is that there is no systemic response because there is a lack of leadership. There is no systemic response on the back of these disasters where we could learn. And the reality is that we should be optimistic because for a country of 5 million people, we could put in place ways of doing things that are better, that are replicable, that can be improved. We should be optimistic that we can do those things, but we choose not to. And it's a good time for us to talk about this because there is a general election that's happening out there right now. I don't know if any of you watched the leaders' debate. It was extremely frustrating. I resented having to watch it. I was on TV the next morning to comment on it, so I was like, oh, I better watch it, right? Otherwise I can't comment on it. And I could have, because I could have just read the pamphlet they had put out, and that's pretty much what they did. They're walking pamphlets, right? So it looks like the country is in the mood for change, which is fine, right? Because really there is not much of a muchness, there's much of a muchness between them when it comes to climate change. When asked, the two Chris's responded that their response to climate change was recycling. God help us. But the reality is that this is, I think, the last election where we can pretend that we can be cute and have pamphlets for dealing with challenges that are big and complex. And the constraint and the reason why there'll be is we're running out of money. We're not bankrupt, we're not a banana republic, but all the promises that we have made around universal health, around education, around superannuation, these things cannot be sustained with our relatively low taxes, with our constant demands for lower taxes and tax cuts every time there is an election. When we had the earthquakes, we borrowed money and invested. That was the right thing to do. When we had COVID, we borrowed money when we invested in the economy. That was the right thing to do. When we're living in the fat tails, there will be many more of these events. How much more are you going to borrow? Where is the backstop? Where is the resilience and the depth to be able to do so? When you look at the amount of debt that we're carrying on the right-hand side, what you can see is there is no pattern depending on who's in power. Whether it's a Labour government or a national government, it doesn't really matter, right? It's more about we respond to the crises as they happen. That's good that we're responsive. But what is not good is that we don't have a systemic response to these crises for the plan for the next one. Do you know we still don't have a credible plan for the next pandemic? It wasn't that long ago, but already all of that infrastructure has been unwound because we're so short-term. We're so short-term in our thinking, and yet the climate change world that we're talking about is going to create these extraordinary pressures. And I'm optimistic that running out of money will force us to have these conversations. Because when you can't just give a handout, a lolly scramble for every election, you might have to engage with the fundamental issues that matter for New Zealand. The other reason that's going to make it much harder for our politicians to pretend that we have headroom or that we have runway is our demographics are turning against us very, very quickly. I showed that chart on the left-hand side to dispel any myths that somehow we have the ability to continue doing things as they are. On that left-hand side, you can see the share of New Zealand population that's aged between 16 and 64. And over the course of the next 30 years, it will shrink. It doesn't matter how much immigration we have, it is going to shrink. One thing you don't need is you don't need any forecast for when it comes to demographics. People just get older. We know that. And we're just not having enough babies, too late for that. It is going to happen regardless of what we do. Our entire tax system as we know it is not sustainable. Our promises that we have made are not sustainable. We will not have the resilience and the flexibility to be able to respond to future crises because we are running out of the one group of people that we tax the hell out of, which is people who are working. We also know that in many parts of New Zealand, we're going to find those big divides, that we are going to see pretty much all the population growth is going to be coming from over 65s. Nothing wrong with old people, but they're not going to be the ones that are paying the taxes and doing the work. We're going to see this divergence between our provinces and our cities. We're going to see these divisions that are going to be sown across so many different lines. We're already starting to see the beginnings of that in terms of these changes in society. How we have done things in the last 30 years will not be sustained over the next 30. The reason I tell you this is because these changes are not nice things to talk about. These are things that force us to think about a world that is very different. And it's going to be climate change that's piled on top of all those other things. That's the precondition for all those other things that will take place, these big crises that will take place. I'm not welcome in Wanganui. I think some of you might know that. I called them a zombie town one time. And I haven't been back since then. They did have a zombie march in my honor. I was very, very honored. But the reality is that my forecasts were completely wrong. Wanganui grew rapidly after I left and called them a zombie town. I'd like to take some credit and say they turned things around, but I suspect there was other things. But we shouldn't be complacent that just because I was wrong 10 years ago means that these demographic shifts are not going to happen. The reality is that we're going to experience climate change while there is a regime change, and the risks that we live with are going to be multiplicative. Climate change is real. The experiences of floods, fires, droughts, these are going to be more frequent, more damaging. But we also know in the background, the way that we think about the global economy, the way that we interact with each other as global citizens, that Washington consensus is breaking down. We know that what we relied on, and I don't know if Rod wants to hear this or not, central banks are no longer that relevant. They're not trusted. And that loss of credibility makes it much harder for us to be able to go, we have credible economic managers, we should just get on with some other things in some other way. There is this shaking up of these foundations of how we think about the economy. Bailouts have become the norm, whether it's the global financial crisis or whether it's the earthquake or the floods or the cyclones. We were doing bailouts in every single one of them. We may be able to justify them on individual basis, but can we justify them on a systemic basis? We cannot. I think when you look forward to the next 30 years, we cannot be certain that bailouts are going to persist. I do not think that society will stand for it because we will not have the money for it. We are already on a war footing. What do you think will happen when the climate is so hot that it's unbearable, it's unlivable? We are going to have more wars, we're going to have more realignment of geopolitics. If you think China is a risk, wait until climate change really has its effect. We're seeing shifts, big shifts, on the back of things like climate change and these fears around the structural changes. We're seeing the rise of old thinking, Hamiltonian thinking in places like the US, where they're using the Inflation Reduction Act. Completely misnamed because it's really about bringing back supply chains on climate change stuff to America, right? Politicians will use any label that's necessary to justify the things they want to do, which is fine if it's the right things to do. But the rise of industrial policy, the rise of interventionist governments, the rise of misinformation and disinformation, all of these things are creating this extraordinary backdrop for us to deal with this extraordinary existential challenge. But also, in this, I think there is hope. In hope that we know that the regime that we've lived with for the last 30, 40 years is shifting. We have the opportunity and power to be able to change it and shape it if we want to. One fly in the ointment that I put this chart up all the time because I really worry about how we're going to find that consensus within our society to be able to make that change. When I think back to New Zealand's history, there were two really big regimes that we created. One of them was the welfare state after the Second World War, and the other was the current one that we live in after the reforms of the 1980s. And if you think about the Second World War, that regime shift, it was very much the greatest generation who were the largest group of voters. There were over 50% of voters. And they remained that very large block of voters. They were the median voters. Their values, their votes carried the day. They were able to sustain that change in vision of what New Zealand was going to be. And for many reasons, including the disastrous policies of Muldoon, we had those significant changes of economic reforms in the 1980s. And then and now, it was very much about the boomers who were the majority of voters. There was a certain set of ideals and consensus and social values that center that we were able to carry through and maintain a particular system of society and politics. But when you fast forward to today, there is no single generation that dominates. And I'm very deliberate in not showing all the generations in this chat. I'm only showing the biggest, because that's my idea of trying to tell you that if you're thinking about the center voter, the majority, the consensus, who is it? In politicians' minds, there is a society that have varying interests, but it's like a Venn diagram. There's an overlap, right? All those different circles overlap, and we do consensus economics, center politics, because that has got the biggest group of buy-in. What if we don't have that much overlap? What if instead of a Venn diagram that looks like a flower, it looks like a daisy chain? What if the center is hollow? What if we don't share that many values? What if there is more division in society? If that is the case, it becomes more difficult for us to have durable politics and durable policies. And that is my less optimistic prediction, that this and following general elections, we will see short-lived governments. And if we have short-lived governments, we must have policies and public demands that are more consistent and more persistent. There are three different ways that I think about change, and I think this is what we're talking about today, is we can tinker with existing policies. We can make our existing policies better. We can introduce new policies, or we can change what we're looking for, the targets, the objectives, the purpose of why we do things. And in many ways, what we heard about today has been some of those things, right? Right at the beginning, I think we heard about introducing new policies, but not necessarily a complete shift in what we want to achieve. I think what Rose was trying to present was this completely different imagination of what success looks like. Our picture of success looks different. The world that we imagine looks different. These are actually really difficult things and different things that we're talking about. We need to be very clear amongst our conversations. What is it that we're actually trying to do? Are we trying to change the system as it is today and the policies that we see today? Or are we trying to actually drive for something different? They're entirely different conversations and require different systems of governance, politics, but also social and business interaction. For businesses, I think there are quite simple choices in front of us, but they're not always the same. We can respond to regulation, whatever there might be, and say that's enough. Or we can be customer-driven. But we know that there are challenges. If it's regulation, it's easy because it's coordinated. It applies to everybody. You're not going to miss out by doing more than your competitor, right? But what if it's customer-driven, as we heard? What if it's Tesco saying, nah, not going to buy from you? But what if your three big customers for your meat or dairy or whatever want three different standards of outcomes? What do you do then? And what if those standards and those demands change over time? Because that is exactly what will happen. When it is not led by international agencies or by regulation, we are going to have ad hocery that'll be right through the system. What we're going to find is this variability and uncertainty of what those demands are. You have no recourse to what those demands are. When Tesco says you should do this, you can't go and appeal to somebody because they say, well, if you're not going to do it, nah, not going to buy from you. The demands and consequences are much greater. And hence, in many ways for me, the consequence for business is do or die. It is an existential risk, not only for the planet, but also for your businesses. It doesn't mean there will be no other business that will come in your place to do something differently. But why would you want to give up what you have? You've already built something. Why would you not want that to be able to take advantage of the opportunities and that's already out there? And that's what Dr. Carr talked about, right? That fundamentally, we can think about this as a tax and regulation and the things that are being done to us versus saying there are things that we want to do because there is an opportunity, because the size of the prize is big, because the opportunity is my business will survive and thrive. Fundamentally, from an outside view in, and I'm just an economist, right? What the hell do I know? But I can tell you that these are the things that come to me when I think about this wider landscape of what's happening with climate change and social change and political change and regime shift. Fundamentally, the big thing you could ask yourself is, do I have the license to operate? I say that because when customer demands change faster than regulation, you're going to have to keep up and you're going to have to be ahead of the regulation. You cannot say, the government said something and I'm doing just enough. I'm up with the regulation. That's enough. That should be enough. And that's not a defense. Regulation and those demands from customers may be ad hoc and may be volatile. If governments are changing, as you saw, recycling apparently is our path to climate change response, we are going to see variability in what kinds of policies governments put forward. And that makes it difficult for government for business, because businesses crave certainty of the framework, right? We want to know what the boundaries are so we can get on with it. And we want those boundaries to be set. And what I'm trying to describe to you, those boundaries are going to be shifting and volatile, because they may sometimes be set by customers, sometimes be set by governments, and they will change. You have to think about, is my social license earned by the high water mark of the demands for how we do business, or is it the lowest common denominator? I would make the charge that in New Zealand, we like to go for the lowest common denominator in the way we do things. Just enough. And that might not be enough for the social license for what's coming next. When we're living with volatility, it is about absolutely expecting and planning for frequent change, whether it's in the climate or whether it's the regulation or whether it's the demands from your customers. Expect less coherence in the regulatory system. We have already seen that. Our regulatory system is becoming increasingly incoherent. They're uncoordinated. Something's happening there, something's happening there, and the incentives and demands are not joined up. And they won't be, because we're dealing with a really messy and volatile world. And expect a much greater degree of scrutiny than we've been used to. We know that already our banks are working really hard to collect lots of information about what you do in terms of your emissions and those kinds of things. They're not perfect, but you know what? Once they have the data, they will use that against you if you're not doing enough. Banks and our financial institutions are fair weather friends. They will support you when it suits, and they will walk away when it doesn't. They owe nothing to you. Do or be done to. To me, it's about knowing your high water mark. What is your minimum that you must do and sustain to have the social license to operate? You must be able to verify your license to operate and to be able to communicate it. As business, you might be in an industry, but for all of us, business is about relationships. It's about the collection of people that you have to be able to serve the needs of your customers. It's as simple as that. You might happen to be in industry X, Y, Z, doesn't matter. Fundamentally, business is relational. And being able to communicate and with verifiable information is absolutely, absolutely critical. And when you think about the investments that you make in your business and the decisions that you make in your business, it's all about defending the wins that you have and the fast fails on innovation. Because you're going to have to work so hard in the face of the coming volatility. You will be innovating. You're always innovating. But you're going to have to be more brutal in the way that you decide how to do things. Climate change is not something particularly scary in terms of business, because that is literally the environment that we'll be living in. My call out to all of you is, we know that this change is coming, this change is happening. It's really about asking, what sort of business do I want to be able to actually have a business? Thank you.